My name is Arthur, and I am 68 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a federal forensic auditor. I spent my entire career staring into complex ledgers, tracking hidden assets, and unmasking the greediest lies human nature has to offer. I always believed that the greatest legacy a man could leave his family was an impenetrable wall of financial security. But just 3 days ago, I cut my fishing trip on Lake Michigan short and drove back to our home in Evanston, a quiet northern suburb of Chicago. What welcomed me was an empty house, the suffocating stench of industrial muriatic acid, and my wife, fighting for her life in the intensive care unit. When I rushed into Northwestern Memorial Hospital, my heart pounding against my ribs, I expected to see our nephew Julian and his wife Chloe weeping in the hallway. Julian's parents died in a car crash when he was only 8, and my wife Eleanor and I raised him as our own, pouring all our love and every resource we had into his future. Instead, I found them lounging comfortably in the VIP waiting area outside the premium suites. Chloe was sipping an expensive matcha latte, while Julian, dressed in a sharp, custom-tailored suit, was smiling and laughing into a tablet. He was on a video call with investors, casually pitching the next funding round for their tech startup, completely unfazed by the fact that the woman who raised him was dying just a few feet away. They thought I was just a clueless, grieving old man who didn't understand modern technology. They figured I would blindly trust them and look the other way, just like I had for the last 40 years. Instead of walking up to them, I turned around, stepped into an empty restroom near the nurse's station, and pulled out my phone. I locked down every single financial account tied to our family trust, completely severing any access to our funds. The absolute panic that was about to hit them when their credit cards were ruthlessly declined was only the first lesson of my final audit. Before I tell you how this ends, if you are someone who believes that arrogance and greed must pay the ultimate price, please stay with me through this long reckoning. Earlier that afternoon, the drive back to the Chicago suburbs along the interstate should have been relaxing. Eleanor had been a high school principal for 30 years. She knew me inside and out, and she knew exactly when I needed to unplug from the high-stress world of numbers and get some fresh air. Together, we had built a comfortable, affluent life. I even stopped at a roadside florist to pick up a bouquet of white lilies, her absolute favorite, just to surprise her. When I pulled into the driveway, the entire house was dead quiet. Usually at this hour, she'd be in the sunroom, tending to her prized orchids. I used my brass key to push open the heavy walnut front door, but there was no smell of baking cookies, no sound of classical music playing on the radio. It was just an eerie, unnatural, deafening silence. But it wasn't just the quiet that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was the smell. The air was thick with the sharp, chemical reek of high-concentration industrial muriatic acid. It's a highly corrosive liquid typically used for cleaning outdoor brickwork, but right now it was so overpowering it made it hard to breathe. I set the lilies down on the entryway table and called out Eleanor's name. Nothing. I walked quickly toward the sunroom at the back of the house and noticed that the antique terracotta floor tiles leading to the door were unnaturally clean. Certain spots looked completely bleached, as if someone had scrubbed them repeatedly with frantic, destructive force using harsh chemicals. Eleanor would never use muriatic acid indoors. She always said it would ruin the glaze on the terracotta. My heart started racing, and my forensic auditor instincts screamed that something terrible had happened. I walked into the kitchen and saw the red light on the landline answering machine on the island flashing frantically. I pressed play, and the cold, mechanical voice of a hospital dispatcher echoed through the empty kitchen. Mrs. Eleanor is in critical condition in the ER with severe head trauma. She is currently in a deep coma. The message had been left late the previous night. Out on the lake, I had no cell service, so I missed everything. I dropped my car keys and ran out the door like a madman. During the frantic drive to the hospital, my mind was a chaotic blur. I burst into the emergency lobby, and a compassionate nurse guided me up to the intensive care unit on the third floor. The smell of antiseptic and rubbing alcohol up there was different from the acid in my hallway, but it felt just as grim. Through the thick glass window of room 312, I saw her. My elegant, vibrant Eleanor looked so tiny and fragile in that hospital bed. Her head was wrapped in thick white bandages, and a large plastic tube was running down her throat, hooked up to a mechanical ventilator that was breathing for her. The rhythmic hissing sound of the machine was the only noise in the room. I pressed my hand against the cold glass, tears cutting through the wrinkles on my face, feeling a crushing, agonizing sense of helplessness. I wiped my eyes, took a deep breath, and walked down the sterile hallway toward the waiting area. That's when I witnessed the scene I described earlier, Julian and Chloe, casually taking their investor meeting. I stood there in the corridor, letting their sickening indifference wash over me. I forced my clenched fists to relax, plastered an exhausted, confused, and broken expression onto my face, and shuffled into the seating area. Julian looked up and his business smile vanished instantly. He snapped the tablet shut. Chloe sat up straight, instantly throwing on a fake, tragic mask of concern that was so hollow it made my stomach turn. "Uncle, you're finally here!" Julian stood up and gave me a stiff, awkward hug. "We've been calling you all night. This is horrible, just absolutely horrible." I stared deep into his eyes, forcing my voice to tremble with emotion. "What happened, Julian? How did she get hurt this badly?" Julian let out an exaggerated sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. "It was a freak accident. Aunt Eleanor was watering plants in the sunroom and slipped. She fell backward hard, and the back of her head slammed right into the edge of that heavy cast-iron radiator. Chloe and I just happened to be stopping by to check on her, and we found her unconscious in a pool of blood. The doctor said the swelling in her brain is severe." Chloe reached out and patted my arm with a manicured hand. "We were terrified, Arthur. We called 911 immediately." I stared at the two of them, and a cold, dark truth began to crystallize in my mind. The cast-iron radiator in the sunroom is bolted to the north wall, but all the water valves and plant shelves are grouped together on the south wall, 20 feet away. To slip on the south side and somehow violate the laws of physics by flying across the entire room to hit a radiator on the north wall was impossible. But I didn't call him out. I just nodded, playing the part of a broken, dazed old man whose brain had gone entirely blank. "Thank God you two were there," I choked out, deliberately letting my voice crack. "The medical bills. This is going to cost a fortune. I need to go down to the billing department and give them my insurance information." Julian quickly raised a hand to stop me. He offered a reassuring, perfectly practiced smile. "Actually, Uncle, don't worry about that at all. Since we couldn't reach you and the hospital needed a deposit for emergency surgery, I used Aunt Eleanor's digital authorization yesterday to log into her everyday savings account and took care of the upfront costs. Right now, you just need to focus on being here with her." Behind that flawless smile, I caught a glimpse of something else, the desperate, greedy spark of a gambler who thought he had just hit the jackpot. "Thank you, Julian," I said softly. "You've always been such a good boy." I turned toward the elevators, but I didn't go back to the ICU. I went straight down to the billing department on the first floor, handed over my ID, and requested a printout of every transaction on my wife's account from the last 24 hours. The billing clerk typed on her keyboard, looking at me with sympathy. "Sir, your account currently shows an outstanding balance for emergency services, but there haven't been any payments made in the past day. Our financial department usually waits until a patient is stable before collecting deposits." The blood in my veins turned to ice. Julian had lied about where she fell. He had lied about what she hit. And now he was lying about paying the medical bills. I walked into a secluded stairwell in the hospital, and my hands were now steady as a rock. All my grief had been replaced by a freezing, hyper-focused clarity. I pulled up the back-end network of our family trust, an encrypted system only I had access to. Julian thought we only had a joint account for everyday expenses, but he had no clue Eleanor had a massive, separate private foundation account. money we had set aside to donate to educational institutions. With the speed of a veteran forensic auditor, I tore through the transaction logs. My breath caught in my throat. Exactly 1 hour before the ambulance was ever dispatched to my house, a massive $500,000 wire transfer had been forced out of Eleanor's private account. The recipient was an offshore shell company registered under Julian's name. Every single piece of the puzzle locked together with terrifying precision. The burning smell of acid on the floor tiles, the stolen fortune, and my wife lying in her own blood. Julian hadn't just stumbled upon an unconscious Eleanor. He and Chloe had cornered her, forcing a violent confrontation over that money. When Eleanor flatly refused, they attacked her. Then they spent an entire hour using highly corrosive chemicals to scrub the floors and destroy the evidence, all while finalizing the theft of her life savings, before they finally bothered to call 911. They thought they had committed the perfect crime. They thought this old man would just sit by the hospital bed and weep while they used blood money to plug the bleeding holes in their failing tech company. I dialed a specific number from my contacts. It only rang twice before a sharp, deeply professional voice answered, "Marcus and Associates." "Marcus," my voice echoed with total calm through the concrete stairwell. "It's Arthur." "Arthur, good to hear from you. What can I do for you?" asked my old friend, a former heavy-hitting federal prosecutor who was now a top-tier state attorney. "Listen to me very carefully, Marcus," I said, leaving absolutely no room for debate. "I need you to execute our highest-level asset lockdown protocol immediately. Freeze every single checking, savings, and investment account tied to our family trust. Block all crypto asset portals. Revoke every authorized user credit card issued to Julian and Chloe. I want a financial firewall around my assets that no living soul can penetrate, and I want it done in 60 seconds. There was a brief pause on the line as Marcus instantly grasped the gravity of the situation. "Consider it done, Arthur. Is this an emergency?" "Yes," I replied, staring at the heavy metal door of the stairwell. "The nephew I raised just declared war on his own family, and I'm making sure he doesn't have a single penny left for ammunition." After hanging up, I found a plastic chair in a quiet corner near the hospital cafeteria. From this hidden vantage point, I had a clear view of the checkout registers. The harsh, overhead fluorescent lights hummed loudly. I sat there with my hands folded neatly in my lap, keeping my breathing steady. The initial shock and burning rage had distilled into something much colder and far more lethal. I was no longer a grieving husband reacting blindly. I was a senior auditor waiting for a fraudulent ledger to collapse. I knew I wouldn't have to wait long. About 20 minutes later, I saw Julian and Chloe walking down the brightly lit corridor toward the dining area. They had a bounce in their step, still radiating that sickening aura of arrogance. Chloe had a limited edition designer purse slung over her shoulder, and Julian held his latest smartphone tight against his ear, gesturing wildly as he talked about bridge loans and venture capital. They were living in a completely parallel universe from Eleanor, who was upstairs fighting for her next breath. They strolled casually to the front of the line, picking up expensive imported sparkling water and a couple of premium salads without a care in the world. I kept my eyes locked on them as they stepped up to the register. Without even glancing at the cashier, Julian kept talking loudly on his phone, casually sliding a heavy black titanium credit card out of his designer wallet and tossing it onto the metal counter. The cashier politely scanned the items and inserted the metal card into the chip reader. She stared at the screen for a moment, frowned, and ran it a second time. I leaned forward just an inch. The trap I had meticulously set was finally closing. The cashier politely cut Julian off, her voice low as she informed him that the card had been declined. Julian let out a loud, impatient sigh and rolled his eyes, treating the woman like she was an incompetent idiot. He told the person on the other end of his call to hold on, turned back to the cashier, and snapped that the machine had to be broken. He aggressively shoved a platinum business card across the counter. The cashier patiently slid it through again. "Declined." I watched as the arrogant impatience on Julian's face instantly shattered into pure confusion. He pulled the phone away from his ear, staring blankly at the cashier. His voice rose as he ordered her to try it one more time, insisting he knew for a fact there was at least $100,000 of available credit on that card. The cashier just shook her head and quietly suggested he step aside to call his bank. Chloe, looking visually annoyed by the delay, told Julian to move out of the way. She said she'd just pay with her card so they could get back to their multi-million-dollar business calls. She unzipped her bag, pulled out the black card tied to their primary account, and handed it over with a patronizing smile. The machine let out a sharp, flat rejection beep. Declined. Chloe gasped, pulling her hand back quickly as if the plastic card reader had physically burned her fingers. A small line of exhausted healthcare workers had started to form behind them, and people were beginning to stare at the wealthy couple blocking the queue. Julian's face turned an ugly mottled shade of crimson. He aggressively snatched all his cards off the counter, cursing under his breath. Shoving the sparkling water and salads back toward the startled cashier, he grabbed Chloe by the elbow and roughly pulled her out of the dining area. He was gripping his phone tight, but he wasn't talking about venture capital anymore. He was frantically tapping at the screen, desperately trying to log into his mobile banking app. I watched his thumb fly across the digital keypad. Then he froze dead in his tracks, right in the middle of the hallway. His broad shoulders slumped completely. I knew exactly what that small screen was telling him. Account frozen, access denied. Please contact your trust administrator immediately. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over Julian's face. He looked at his wife, whispering something incoherent. Chloe dropped her designer purse straight onto the floor. The premium calfskin leather landed right in a sticky puddle of spilled coffee, but she didn't even notice. The color drained entirely from her face. The $500,000 they had violently stolen from Eleanor was now safely locked behind the impenetrable financial firewall Marcus had just built for me. They had zero access to the stolen funds, and their personal credit lines had been completely severed as collateral damage. In the middle of a crowded public hospital hallway, they were instantly broke. Julian snapped his head up, his breathing shallow, desperately scanning the crowded corridor. He was looking for his easiest prey. He was looking for the clueless, grieving old man he thought he could manipulate. I slowly stood up from the plastic chair in the corner. I deliberately slouched my shoulders and curved my spine, making myself look older and smaller than I actually was. Plastering a perfect look of helpless bewilderment onto my face, I shuffled forward, stepping into the open hallway right in his line of sight. Julian spotted me instantly and practically sprinted down the corridor. Chloe was right on his heels, her high heels making a frantic, chaotic clicking sound against the hard floor. "Uncle!" Julian almost shouted as he reached me, grabbing both of my shoulders roughly. He squeezed hard enough to hurt, his hands shaking violently from the adrenaline. "What is going on with the bank accounts, Uncle? Did you do something? Did you call the bank today?" I looked up at him, opening my eyes wide and letting my jaw drop slightly to look completely blindsided. I made sure my voice sounded shaky, weak, and filled with confusion. "What are you talking about, Julian?" I stammered. "What bank accounts? I just went downstairs to get some air. I'm so worried about your aunt, I can't even think straight. Why are you yelling at me in the middle of the hallway?" Julian let go of my shoulders and ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair in pure desperation, ruining his expensive haircut and making himself look unhinged. He was panting heavily. "The credit cards aren't working, Uncle." His voice shook with uncontrollable panic. "My personal card was declined. Chloe's business card was declined. I just tried to log into Aunt Eleanor's administrative account to check the liquid balances, and the entire banking system locked me out. It says all accounts are completely frozen due to a suspected severe security breach." I placed a trembling, wrinkled hand over my chest, acting as though his panicked words were causing me physical distress. "A security breach?" I drew out the words with perfect dramatic timing, letting my voice crack. "Oh my God, Julian. Do you think someone stole your aunt's identity while she was hurt? We have to call the police right now." I knew exactly what he was terrified of hearing. Julian immediately shot his hand out and grabbed my arm again, squeezing so hard it would leave a bruise. "No, Uncle, do not call the police," he gasped out, the word police hitting him like a physical blow to the stomach. "We cannot get law enforcement involved in our family finances right now. This is probably just a stupid, automated banking glitch. Think, Uncle. Try to remember what you did before you drove to the hospital today." I slowly shook my head, letting a single tear slip down my cheek. "I didn't do anything, Julian," I whispered weakly, looking up at him with innocent, helpless eyes. "I came back from the lake and found the house empty. I heard that awful message on the machine and I just drove straight here. I don't even have my wallet on me. I left it on the kitchen island because I was in such a rush. I was actually about to ask if you could buy me a black coffee, because I don't have a single dollar in my pocket. How could I freeze a bank account, Julian? I don't even know your aunt's online banking passwords. You know I don't understand any of this modern tech stuff. She's always handled the books." I watched the realization hit him. He believed me. He believed he was being ruined by a terrible automated banking error, and that his helpless old uncle was utterly powerless to fix it. Julian gave my shoulder a tight squeeze, telling me to stay put. Switching back to the most reassuring, patronizing tone he could muster, he promised he was going to go sort out this banking mistake right away. He grabbed Chloe's hand and practically dragged her toward the heavy emergency exit door at the end of the hall. They thought I would just sit there on that plastic chair like an obedient, frightened child, waiting for them to return. The exact second they disappeared around the corner, I stood up straight. My slouched back squared, and the trembling in my hands stopped completely. Walking with silent, deliberate steps, I crept down the brightly lit corridor toward the heavy fire door. It was propped open a tiny fraction of an inch by a stray plastic door wedge. I leaned my shoulder against the cold metal frame and pressed my ear directly to the gap. The acoustics of the concrete stairwell perfectly amplified their hushed, frantic voices. I didn't miss a single syllable. Chloe was completely unhinged. Her voice had devolved into a vicious, echoing hiss against the gray concrete walls. She demanded to know how Julian planned to fix this mess, reminding him in a lethal tone that they were contractually obligated to wire that $500,000 to a venture capital escrow account by exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I could hear her pacing back and forth, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the cement steps. She made it crystal clear that if they missed that strict deadline, their massive Silicon Valley tech campus deal would fall through completely. Julian tried to calm her down, but his voice was trembling with his own spiraling panic. He told her to keep her voice down so no one would hear. He insisted the money was sitting safely in his offshore shell company, and that the central banking system just needed time to reset its security protocols. He actually called me a clueless old fossil, claiming I didn't possess the mental capacity to intentionally mess with their accounts. But Chloe wasn't buying his weak excuses. She stopped her pacing abruptly and confronted him directly. She asked him if he truly understood how terrifying their financial situation actually was. She reminded him that they hadn't borrowed money from a traditional bank to cover their massive tech campus debts. This was the final piece of the puzzle I had been waiting for. I closed my eyes, listening intently as the ugly, dark truth behind their desperate situation was stripped bare. Months ago, Julian had overextended his tech startup. He was desperate to buy into a high-profile luxury technology park project in Silicon Valley to cement his status in high society. But his personal credit was completely tapped out, and no legitimate financial institution in the state would approve him for another loan. So he went into the darkest corners of the city for alternative financing. He found dangerous people who didn't care about credit scores or standard background checks. He borrowed a massive sum from high-risk loan sharks who demanded exorbitant weekly interest payments and blood as collateral. Chloe's voice shook uncontrollably as she spoke. She told Julian that the violent men who lent them the money weren't going to sit around waiting for a banking system to reset itself. She mentioned a Russian mob boss named Victor, She said Victor had made it explicitly clear that if the wire wasn't finalized by 8 a.m., he would send his men directly to their private apartment. She was crying now, not the fake tears she had put on for her aunt upstairs, but tears of genuine terror for her own physical safety. She reminded Julian that they had signed over their luxury Tesla and their downtown penthouse as direct collateral for this shadow loan. If they defaulted, they would lose everything, be utterly ruined, and face a very real physical threat to their lives. Julian slammed his fist into the metal stair railing, sending a sharp, hollow ring echoing up the stairwell. He swore loudly and viciously, cursing that they had done everything perfectly. He said they had already taken care of his stubborn aunt when she refused to hand over the investment money willingly. He actually used those exact words, taken care of. The blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. Hearing him refer so callously to attacking the woman who raised him, all for a failing business deal, destroyed the very last shred of family mercy I had left in my heart. He tried to justify his brutality to Chloe, claiming Eleanor was just hoarding the family wealth for no reason while he was trying to build an empire. Chloe told him that his precious empire was currently being leveled to the ground. She said they needed liquidity right now, this very second, to survive the night. Aggressively, she suggested they march back into the waiting room and use brute force to make me call the bank and unlock the accounts. Julian shot that reckless idea down immediately. He correctly pointed out that if I called the bank and discovered the accounts were intentionally frozen by our private wealth manager, the whole banking error lie would instantly blow up in their faces. He said I'd start asking highly uncomfortable questions. He realized that if I saw the transaction logs and that massive wire transfer, I would connect the dots real fast and figure out that Eleanor ended up in a pool of blood right after they stole the money. Julian knew keeping me completely in the dark was their only chance at maintaining control. Taking a ragged breath, he tried to manage his spiraling panic and told Chloe he had a brilliant backup plan to save them both. He said he personally knew a corrupt digital notary who owed him a massive favor from a shady business deal in the past. He explained that since my attention was entirely on the hospital and my emotional state was shattered, they had the perfect window of opportunity. He told Chloe he was going to quickly draft a fraudulent digital medical power of attorney and a trust modification deed. He planned to use this forged legal paperwork to secure a massive emergency commercial bridge loan using my 300-acre debt-free Illinois soybean farm as direct collateral. He was confident that the farm held massive equity value and could easily clear their debts. He confidently told Chloe he could get this fraudulent bridge loan approved and funded by tomorrow afternoon, effectively paying off Victor, saving their tech park deal, and leaving no one the wiser. Chloe asked how he planned to get my actual signature on the loan documents. Julian let out a cold, breathless, horrifying chuckle. He said he didn't need my signature at all. He said the corrupt notary would apply the digital stamp without me ever being in the room. He just needed to disappear from the hospital for a few hours to submit the fraudulent paperwork and secure the fast cash. He ordered Chloe to go back to the cafeteria and keep tabs on me. He instructed her to keep me crying and drinking terrible hospital coffee while he went to steal the last piece of value from my generational, century-old family farm. I pulled my ear away from the heavy metal door and stepped back into the bright hospital corridor. My heart was beating at a slow, terrifyingly steady rhythm. They thought they were so incredibly smart, believing they'd found a brilliant legal loophole to escape the loan sharks chasing them. They had no idea I had already logically anticipated every single move they would make in their absolute desperation. I knew exactly what a cornered predator does when you completely cut off their resources. I turned around and walked slowly back to the plastic chair in the hidden corner. It was time to call Marcus again. It was time to let my nephew build his own gallows. While Julian and Chloe were still trapped in their panicked argument inside the concrete stairwell, I quietly slipped out of the hospital through a side emergency exit. The drive back to our Evanston home was completely silent. The sun had fully set, casting long, dark, oppressive shadows across the quiet suburban streets. I gripped the leather steering wheel tightly, feeling the coarse texture under my palms. As a former forensic auditor and director of investigations, I had spent 40 long years of my life studying the iron law of human behavior. Lies always leave a trail. I had spent decades calculating complex variances in massive corporate ledgers, measuring the exact weight of evidence required to break a hardened corporate defense. I knew how numbers moved, and I knew how physical evidence settled in a space. Julian had looked me in the eye and claimed his aunt slipped in the sunroom and hit the back of her head against the cast iron radiator. But my brain instantly processed the spatial geometry of that sunroom, and I knew that physical trajectory was absolutely impossible. The center of the terracotta floor was a full 20 feet away from that radiator. A human body falling from a standing position at that angle could not cross that kind of horizontal distance without a massive external force. Eleanor didn't lose her balance, and she didn't trip. She was pushed with immense violence, or she was struck down. I pulled into the driveway and walked slowly up the brick path to the front door. The moment I turned the brass key, the pungent chemical reek of industrial muriatic acid hit me all over again. It was a sterile, deadly smell that had no business being inside a home filled with 40 years of warm memories. I didn't turn on the main overhead lights. I wanted the house to stay exactly as they had left it. I navigated the dark hallway using only the pale moonlight, filtering through the large living room windows. I walked right past the immaculate hardwood floors and headed straight down to my private study and workshop in the basement. That room was my sanctuary, a meticulously organized space filled with precision instruments and professional-grade investigative tools. I walked past the heavy wooden workbench and opened a reinforced metal equipment cabinet. Reaching past the heavy-duty safe-cracking tools, I grabbed a specific black protective hard case. Nestled in the soft, shock-absorbing foam of that case lay a high-powered, commercial-grade, alternate light source diagnostic flashlight. During my long career in corporate auditing, when we had to raid raided offices in the dead of night to find shredded documents or detect invisible chemical leaks under high pressure, this was the exact piece of professional equipment I used. I knew the strict scientific principles of spectroscopy, inside and out. I knew that organic biological matter, like human blood, strongly absorbs UV light, showing up as a pitch-black, empty void under the beam. I also knew that harsh chemical cleaning agents like industrial muriatic acid, used to destroy a scene, intensely reflect UV light, glowing with a bright, blinding blue-white fluorescence in the dark. I grabbed the heavy, cold metal flashlight, feeling its weight in my hands, and walked slowly back up to the first floor. I stood squarely in the archway of the sunroom and pressed the heavy rubber switch on the side of the flashlight. A thick, intense beam of deep purple light instantly cut through the absolute darkness of the silent house. I swept the bright beam slowly and methodically across the surface of the antique terracotta tiles, checking every single grout line. The results were instantaneous, and they were chilling. The floor leading to the plant stand area lit up under the UV light, like a chaotic, glowing neon map of pure horror. Wide, frantic, blindingly bright blue streaks of muriatic acid completely covered the tiles. I could clearly see the large, erratic swirling patterns left behind by the cloth rags Chloe had used as she desperately tried to scrub the floor clean. The glowing blue tracks overlapped one another, showing the manic speed and blind panic of their cleanup job. They had poured massive, reckless amounts of a highly corrosive, toxic chemical directly onto the floor, trying desperately to erase the physical evidence of their violent greed. I stepped closer, feeling my breathing turn incredibly shallow and my chest tighten. I shifted the UV beam upward from the glowing floor, focusing the intense light directly onto several tipped-over bags of premium organic potting soil and a pair of cast-iron garden shears sitting nearby. Right there, amid the spilled black dirt and the sharp edges of the rusted shears, I finally saw the absolute truth. Nested inside the chaotic, glowing blue stains of the muriatic acid, was a dense, jagged void of pure blackness. In that specific area, the UV light was completely absorbed and swallowed by the surface. It was a large pool of incredibly thick, heavy human blood. It had soaked deep into the porous organic dirt and the crevices of the terracotta tiles, places where the liquid acid simply couldn't reach or wash away. My hands began to shake with a cold, terrifying rage. I lowered the purple beam slightly, looking toward the gardening tools resting quietly by the iron racks. A heavy, sharp garden trowel was sitting at an awkward angle. I swept the purple beam up the thick wooden handle and toward the heavy iron tip. Under the intense light, another pitch-black void appeared near the base of the solid iron trowel. Someone had wiped down the smooth metal surface quickly and carelessly, but the thick blood had settled deep into the intricate mounting grooves near the handle. The terrifying reality of my wife's final conscious moments replayed in my mind with chilling, crystal clarity. Eleanor had somehow discovered that massive, unauthorized, encrypted wire transfer, and she had confronted them right here in this sunroom. She had firmly and bravely refused to let them steal $500,000 to plug the bleeding holes in their shady, desperate tech park financing. Julian, completely enraged by her refusal, had grabbed that heavy garden trowel and struck down the woman who raised him, or he had thrown her with brutal force against the sharp iron racks to silence her forever. They had left her bleeding on the floor while they scrubbed the tiles. I slowly reached out and clicked off the UV flashlight. The sunroom plunged instantly into a completely suffocating darkness. The glowing blue lies and the pitch-black truth vanished from sight, but they were permanently burned into my mind. My beautiful wife was currently lying in a sterile hospital bed with a thick plastic tube forcing mechanical air into her damaged lungs, all because our greedy nephew wanted to fund his vain business ambitions. The time for playing a confused, helpless, grieving old man was officially over. My field investigation was complete. This was no longer a matter of protecting our financial assets. Now it was a matter of calculated total annihilation. I pulled my phone out of my pocket to call Marcus. It was time to start building a permanent, inescapable death trap. I left the suffocating house and drove straight into the heart of the sleeping city. The glowing dashboard clock read midnight, but sleep was the last thing on my mind. I navigated the empty streets until I pulled up to a sleek glass and steel high-rise overlooking the dark waters of the Chicago River. This was Marcus's private penthouse office. Marcus wasn't some ordinary estate lawyer who handled simple wills and testaments. He was a ruthless legal architect who built impenetrable fortresses for massive corporate wealth. I had hired him 15 years ago when my forensic consulting firm started bringing in substantial hidden revenue. But our history went back much further. Years before that, I'd saved his father from a predatory corporate bankruptcy. Marcus owed me a brand of loyalty that money could never buy. He knew how to keep an absolute secret, and he knew how to utterly dismantle anyone who threatened his clients. The night shift security guard recognized me instantly, giving me a silent nod and letting me bypass the front desk to take the private elevator straight to the secure penthouse. Marcus was waiting for me in his spacious study. Even in the dead of night, he was dressed in a sharp, custom suit. He was pouring 2 glasses of aged scotch from a heavy crystal decanter. I gave a slight shake of my head, declining the drink. I needed my mind perfectly sharp for the precise calculations ahead. Sitting down in a heavy leather chair across from his mahogany desk, I told him everything I had found on the sunroom floor. I described the glowing blue streaks of the muriatic acid under the UV light and the dark void where my wife's blood had soaked deep into the dirt and terracotta tiles. I watched as Marcus's face hardened into a mask of pure, freezing anger. His polite, professional demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by the cold-blooded legal predator I paid him to be. He reached for the desk phone immediately, suggesting we call the police chief directly, present the UV evidence, and secure an immediate arrest warrant for attempted murder. I leaned across the wide desk, firmly placing my hand over his to stop him from picking up the receiver. I told him that calling the police now would be a massive strategic mistake. If we brought in the authorities too early, Julian would immediately exercise his right to remain silent. He'd use whatever credit he had left to hire a sleazy, aggressive defense attorney who would argue that Eleanor simply fell during a tragic family argument. Even with the muriatic acid, a clever lawyer could drag a trial out for years without a direct confession, causing endless mental trauma for Eleanor once she woke up. I told Marcus I didn't want a long, messy public trial. I wanted absolute, immediate destruction. I wanted Julian to trap himself so completely, so desperately, that he would beg the police to arrest him just to escape the financial and physical hell I was about to unleash on his life. Marcus leaned back slowly, bringing his hands together and structuring his fingers into a thoughtful pyramid. He asked what the specific parameters of the trap were. With the cold logic I used when analyzing a collapsing Ponzi scheme, I broke down Julian's psychological profile. I explained that Julian was currently backed into a corner by violent loan sharks with a strict 8 a.m. deadline. I told Marcus that despite Julian's immense arrogance, his behavior under extreme pressure was highly predictable. Since I had permanently frozen all liquid assets, his only remaining option was to leverage real estate. I recounted the desperate conversation I had overheard in the hospital parking lot. Julian was planning to use a corrupt digital notary to forge a medical power of attorney and a trust modification. He intended to use those completely fraudulent legal documents to secure a massive emergency commercial bridge loan, using my 300-acre debt-free farm as direct collateral. A cold, dangerous smile spread across Marcus's face as he realized how flawless this upcoming blunder would be. He pointed out that any legitimate high-risk lender would automatically run a title check and route the final authorization directly to his law firm, since Marcus was legally listed as the primary custodian for our family trust assets. "That's exactly what I'm counting on," I replied, my voice steady as water. I instructed Marcus to stay at his desk and wait for the emergency loan authorization request to hit his secure computer network in the morning. I told him that when the fraudulent paperwork arrived, he absolutely must not flag it as fraud, he must not cancel it, and he must not call the police. Instead, I wanted him to completely and officially approve the transaction. I wanted him to let the massive loan process seamlessly, letting Julian believe he had won. But I needed Marcus to execute one vital, lethal modification. He was to alter the final routing path of the funds. While I was inside that elegant penthouse, meticulously designing his total financial execution, my nephew was on the other side of the city, desperately digging his own grave. Julian drove his luxury sedan to a dimly lit, run-down strip mall on the bleak outskirts of the city. He was meeting a disgraced former real estate broker who still held a valid digital notary license. This man was a notorious bottom feeder who stamped shady contracts for quick cash bribes and never asked questions. Julian sat in the cramped, windowless back office of the dingy suite, sweating profusely under the flickering fluorescent lights. The terrifying threats from Victor and his loan shark thugs burned in his mind. He pulled a blank, standard trust power of attorney form from his leather bag. He typed in my name as the incapacitated principal and his own name as the sole authorized agent. He deliberately checked specific legal boxes claiming I was mentally incompetent due to sudden, severe psychological trauma, effectively granting himself absolute unrestricted control over all my real property and financial assets. Then came the final, irreversible step into total criminality. Julian picked up a black ink pen. He didn't hesitate. He felt index zero guilt for the adoptive mother currently bleeding in a hospital, or for the adoptive father he was viciously betraying. He pressed the pen firmly to the paper and fluidly forged my signature on the bottom line. It was a signature he had practiced to perfection back when he was an arrogant teenager trying to fake bad high school report cards. The corrupt notary asked zero questions about the sudden midnight emergency. He simply accepted a thick envelope of bribe cash, applied the heavy official state digital stamp to the forged document, and signed his name, validating a massive, highly dangerous lie. With the fraudulent digital power of attorney officially in hand, Julian immediately opened his laptop on the dirty desk. He logged into a high-risk private lending portal. These were aggressive, predatory lenders who didn't care about standard credit scores or ethical guidelines. They only cared about hard physical collateral and exorbitant weekly interest rates. Julian quickly uploaded the forged power of attorney. He uploaded the legal title deed to my generational farm, which he had secretly photographed weeks ago while pretending to visit us. He officially submitted an application for an expedited commercial bridge loan in the exact amount of $600,000. Citing an absolute family emergency, he requested the massive sum be wired directly to his personal shell company account at the earliest hour of business. He slammed the enter key and watched the digital loading bar finalize the transaction. The private lender's automated financial system immediately flagged the high-value farm property. Following standard legal procedure, the system automatically routed a mandatory verification request directly to Marcus's secure legal network, matching my precise mathematical deductions perfectly. Julian closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, letting out a long, ragged exhale of pure relief. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead. He truly believed he had just outsmarted everyone. He believed the corrupt notary had given him a golden ticket to pay off his dangerous debts. He thought his uncle was just a soft, foolish old man crying alone in a hospital waiting room, completely oblivious to the millions moving in the dark. He had absolutely no idea that his perfectly forged loan application was flying straight into a legal trap, coiled so tightly it was about to snap his entire life in half. The first pale light of morning was beginning to break over the city skyline as I concluded my meeting with Marcus. The board was perfectly set. The forgeries were submitted. The violent loan sharks were waking up. It was time for the sun to rise on the most devastating day of Julian's life. Pale morning light crawled slowly across the sterile white floor of the intensive care unit. I sat in a stiff plastic chair by my wife's bedside, holding her cold, fragile hand in both of mine. The rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the ventilator, breathing for her, was the only sound in the quiet room. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, artificial cadence. I stared at the steady green line on the heart monitor, tracking the fragile pulse of her life. The burning rage from last night had completely hardened into something like solid steel. I was no longer just a husband mourning a tragedy. I was the architect of a total, calculated demolition. I gently brushed a strand of gray hair from her bandaged forehead and softly whispered a vow into the quiet room. I promised her that the people who did this to her were about to lose everything they had ever touched. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, the phone in my coat pocket vibrated silently. I carefully let go of my wife's hand and stepped out into the quiet hospital corridor. It was Marcus. His voice was sharp and abrupt, completely skipping any morning pleasantries. "The automated legal alerts on my secure network just triggered, Arthur," he said, his tone hyper-professional and tightly controlled. "The private shadow lender system formally requested a title verification on your farm property 15 minutes ago." Marcus explained that Julian was moving with terrifying speed. He had submitted a massive application for a commercial bridge loan in the exact amount of $600,000. He had put up every single ounce of equity in my fully paid-off family farm as the sole collateral. The boy I raised was trying to steal my inherited land just to save his own skin from the mob. I asked Marcus to describe the paperwork. I could hear the rustle of heavy paper over the phone speaker. Marcus sounded personally insulted by the amateur nature of the crime. Julian used a standard trust power of attorney template he must have downloaded from a public website. Marcus explained with a cold scoff. He actually checked the boxes, claiming you suffered sudden, permanent psychological trauma. He granted himself absolute control over all your real property and liquid assets. As for the signature, Arthur, it's a highly confident forgery, but it lacks the physical pressure of your actual handwriting. He even tracked down a disgraced notary over on the east side to slap an official state seal on it late last night. Marcus told me the notary was a known criminal who had narrowly escaped losing his license after a massive real estate scandal 5 years ago. Marcus paused, taking a slow, deep breath. Then he laid out the standard legal playbook. I have the fraud investigation unit waiting on the other line, Arthur. I'm prepared to flag this application as fraudulent immediately. We can completely intercept the loan transfer, report that corrupt notary to the state licensing board, and have the police arrest Julian for felony forgery before he even finishes his morning coffee. Marcus was a brilliant attorney, but he thought like a shield. He wanted to block the incoming strike and protect the assets. But I was an auditor. I thought like a demolition expert. I didn't want to block the attack. I wanted to use the immense weight of that attack to crush the person throwing it. Do not flag the application as fraud, Marcus, I said, my voice low and completely flat, echoing slightly in the empty hospital hallway. I don't want you to intercept anything. I want you to formally verify the clean title on the farm and approve that commercial loan. A long, heavy silence fell over the line. Marcus was rarely caught off guard, but my command clearly stunned him. Arthur, you're asking me to formally validate a completely fraudulent legal document, he warned, his voice dropping to a cautious whisper. If I approve this, the shadow lender will instantly release $600,000 based on a massive criminal lie. They will place a heavy physical lien on your family's farm. You are effectively handing Julian the exact weapon he needs to save his tech park deal. I'm not handing him a weapon, Marcus, I replied, looking through the glass window at my wife lying motionless in her bed. I'm giving him just enough slack, and I'm going to let him dig his own grave. I explained the precise structural flaw in Julian's desperate plan. If we intercepted the loan now, Julian would simply panic and scramble to find another illegal avenue to pay off the loan sharks. He would be on high alert and unpredictable. I needed him to feel absolutely secure. I needed him to believe he had successfully outsmarted the system. Only then would he confidently march straight into the ultimate trap without looking back. I passed my specific instructions down to Marcus. As the legal custodian of the family trust, Marcus had the ultimate legal authority to dictate how any loan secured by our property was physically dispersed. I told him to approve the loan, but to legally mandate that the massive chunk of capital must never be wired to Julian's personal shell company. Instead, Marcus was to use his custodial power to force the $600,000 directly into a secure blind escrow account. This specific escrow account was entirely controlled by a charitable foundation, a donor-advised fund, that I had quietly set up 5 years ago. Marcus let out a sharp, sudden breath over the phone. The absolute genius of the legal maneuver clicked into place in his mind. He understood exactly what I was building. By forcing the funds into the charitable escrow, the shadow lender would still legally register the loan as successfully funded. The automated system would instantly send a digital notification to Julian's phone, telling him his $600,000 had been approved and released. Julian would see that glorious approval message and be convinced his massive debts were entirely resolved. He would march proudly into his commercial real estate closing meeting today, thinking he was a wealthy, high-powered player, but the money would never touch his hands. It would be completely swallowed by an untouchable charitable trust he didn't even know existed. He would have successfully committed massive federal bank fraud. He would have collateralized a property he didn't actually own to violent, high-risk lenders, and he would walk away from that massive criminal effort with $0 to show for it. Execute the routing modification, Marcus, I ordered, feeling a cold, deep satisfaction settle into my bones. Approve the forged paperwork. Let the shadow lender release the funds and trap every single dollar in the charitable trust. Make sure the automated approval message goes straight to Julian's phone. I want him to smile today. I want him to feel the relief of absolute victory right up until the exact second his entire world caves in. "Consider it done, Arthur," Marcus replied, his voice now carrying a sharp, dangerous edge of anticipation. "The trap is officially live. I'll monitor the wire and confirm the second the funds are fully locked in the charitable trust." I ended the call and slid the phone back into my pocket. Turning around, I walked silently back into the intensive care unit. I took my seat on that stiff plastic chair and gently took Eleanor's cold hand back into mine. The sun was fully up now, washing the pale hospital room in bright morning light. Somewhere out in the city, my nephew was about to receive a digital notification that would make him feel like a king. He had absolutely no idea he had just signed his own financial death warrant, and that his quiet, elderly uncle was the one holding the pen. Julian walked out of the bright hospital lobby and stepped into the dim, concrete parking garage. The air was thick with the heavy scent of car exhaust and damp cement. He was completely exhausted after staying up all night, to lie to my face and scrub his adoptive mother's blood off the hardwood floors. But he was currently riding a massive wave of pure adrenaline. Just 10 minutes ago, his expensive smartphone had vibrated in his pocket. It was an automated digital notification from the private shadow lender. The message clearly stated that his $600,000 commercial bridge loan had been officially approved. The funds, it claimed, were currently processing and scheduled for an immediate wire transfer. Julian felt absolutely invincible. He believed he had successfully gamed the entire system. He believed his forged paperwork was a work of pure genius, and that his financial nightmare was completely over. He twirled the keys to his luxury sedan around his finger, humming a light tune as he walked deeper into the shadows of the garage structure. He arrived at his premium black electric sedan, parked in a secluded corner on the 3rd level. He pressed the key fob to unlock the doors. The car's headlights flashed briefly, illuminating the dark concrete pillars around him. As the lights dimmed, 2 massive, heavy silhouettes peeled themselves away from the concrete wall right behind his vehicle. Julian stopped dead in his tracks, the arrogant smile instantly vanishing from his face. 2 men stepped into the dim halo of the overhead parking lights. They weren't wearing cheap leather jackets or looking like common street criminals. They wore immaculate, dark-tailored suits, looking like high-level corporate security contractors. But that only made them twice as terrifying. They were professional collectors employed by Victor. These were men who never made empty threats and never left a job unfinished. The taller of the 2 men stepped forward. His footsteps made absolutely no sound on the hard concrete. He moved with a chilling, predatory grace that clearly came from a lifetime of physical violence. Julian tried to take a step back, but his spine hit the cold metal door of his own car. He was completely cornered. The tall man stopped just inches from Julian's face, entirely invading his personal space. The man didn't yell, and he didn't raise his voice. He spoke in a low, calm, completely flat tone that echoed chillingly through the empty parking structure. "Victor sent us to check on his investment, Julian," the man said softly. "We've been trying to reach you all morning. Our boss doesn't appreciate it when his business partners dodge his calls, especially when they owe him a massive sum of money." Julian swallowed hard, his throat completely dry. The feeling of total invincibility he had just felt completely evaporated, replaced by primitive, physical terror. He stammered, trying to explain that he had been at the hospital all night, dealing with a sudden family medical emergency. He tried to sound like a grieving, dutiful son, but his voice cracked with pathetic fear. The second man stepped forward, leaning heavily against the hood of Julian's sedan. He casually inspected his fingernails, completely ignoring Julian's frantic excuses. "We don't care about your family emergency, Julian," the tall man smoothly cut him off. "We only care about the wire transfer." Victor made the timeline very clear. You were supposed to transfer the full balance by 8 o'clock this morning. You missed the deadline. Victor is very disappointed, and when Victor is disappointed, people lose their property. Sometimes they lose their teeth. Sometimes they lose their wives. The blunt threat to Chloe hung heavily in the damp garage air. Julian's hands began to shake uncontrollably. He knew the horrifying things these men were capable of. But then his mind desperately grabbed onto the digital lifeline he had just received. He remembered the automated approval message sitting safely in his pocket. The forged loan had been approved. The money was supposedly on its way. The extreme arrogance that defined his entire personality suddenly came rushing back. He took a deep breath, forcing his trembling hands to steady. "You tell Victor he has absolutely nothing to worry about," Julian said, his voice suddenly rising with a burst of false confidence. "I have the money. The funds are absolutely secure. I just finalized a massive commercial bridge loan using a prime piece of suburban real estate. The lender officially approved the transfer 15 minutes ago." Julian slowly reached into the pocket of his custom suit jacket. The two men tensed slightly, watching his hand with guarded focus. Julian pulled out his smartphone and quickly unlocked the screen. He opened the private lender's secure portal and held the glowing screen right in front of the tall man's face. "See for yourself," Julian ordered, a smug arrogance creeping back into his voice. "Look at the screen. $600,000 has been officially approved, and the wire is currently processing. It's heading straight to my holding account. The central banking system just needs a standard 24-hour clearing period to process a transaction of this size." The tall man stared at the glowing screen in silence for a long time. He read the official approval notice and the pending transfer status. His cold expression didn't change at all, but he slowly nodded his head. He looked back up at Julian, taking in the smug, arrogant grin returning to the younger man's face. "Victor is in a bank, Julian," the man said softly. "He doesn't care about processing delays or automated messages. He only cares about hard cash safely deposited into his own account." The man suddenly shot his hand out, firmly grabbing the lapels of Julian's expensive custom suit. He effortlessly lifted Julian forward, forcing him up onto his tiptoes. Julian gasped at the sudden pain and terror, his phone dropping with a loud clatter onto the hard concrete floor. The man brought his face incredibly close, so close Julian could feel his cold breath against his skin. "You have exactly 24 hours left," the man whispered, his voice sharp and lethal. "We will be waiting for you tomorrow morning at your real estate closing meeting. If you sit down at that conference table and those funds aren't fully cleared in the escrow account, we won't be asking for money anymore. We will simply take everything you own. We will take this car. We will take your downtown apartment. And then we're going to take you and your wife for a very long ride." The man suddenly let go. Julian stumbled backward, slamming hard against his car and gasping for air. The two men turned around and walked silently back into the dim shadows of the parking garage, completely vanishing from sight. Julian stood there under the dim lighting, trembling violently. He slowly bent over and picked up his dropped phone. The screen was slightly cracked, but the digital approval message was still glowing brightly. Julian wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and let out a shaky breath. A slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He looked at the cracked screen and actually laughed out loud in the empty garage. He truly believed he had just faced down the most dangerous men in the city and won. He believed the money was on its way to save him. He had absolutely no idea that the money was already permanently locked inside my charitable trust, and that tomorrow he would march into his commercial real estate, closing entirely empty-handed. I sat in the stiff plastic chair by my wife's bedside, watching her chest rise and fall evenly under the thin white blanket. The rhythmic sound of the mechanical ventilator was the only constant in the silent room. I had been sitting here for hours, perfectly playing the role of the devoted, grieving husband, but my mind was actively calculating the next necessary move in this dangerous game. I knew that Julian had just faced the violent consequences of his endless greed down in the dark parking garage. I also knew that his wife, Chloe, was still lurking somewhere on the third floor of this hospital. She had been left behind to keep a close eye on me. But Chloe wasn't just a passive observer. She was an incredibly greedy and desperate woman who was watching her lavish lifestyle burn to ashes. The automated banking error excuse Julian gave her wasn't enough to quiet her absolute terror. She needed direct access to that locked $500,000 right now, this very second. I decided that now was the perfect time to give her the exact opportunity she was desperately waiting for. I slowly stood up from the plastic chair, letting out a soft groan to emphasize my fake weakness. I stretched my back and walked out of the intensive care unit, leaving the heavy wooden door slightly ajar. I walked slowly down the brightly lit corridor toward the nurse's station. I didn't go all the way to the public waiting room. Instead, I just turned the corner and stepped into a dark alcove near the supply closet. Standing completely still in the shadows, I silently counted the seconds. I understood the psychological blueprint of a cornered thief perfectly. The moment a perceived threat leaves the immediate area, the thief will always slip out to finish the job. I waited for exactly 3 minutes. Then I turned around and walked silently back to my wife's room, making sure my footsteps didn't make a sound on the polished floors. Peeking through the large glass observation window embedded in the heavy door, I saw the exact scene I had designed. The moment Chloe thought the coast was completely clear, she had slipped into the quiet room. She wasn't standing by the metal bed frame crying softly for her severely injured aunt. She wasn't gently holding Eleanor's hand, praying for a quick recovery. She was standing over my helpless, comatose wife in an aggressive stance, looking exactly like a hungry vulture circling a wounded animal. Todd's expensive designer clothes looked slightly wrinkled, and her perfectly styled hair was beginning to fall apart. In her left hand, Chloe held a black digital tablet. It was a high-end hardware crypto wallet terminal, a highly secure device I recognized instantly as the one Julian used for large-scale cryptocurrency asset transfers. The central banking system had completely blocked access to the massive fortune they had violently stolen from Eleanor. But Chloe was highly manipulative, and she was smart enough to understand how advanced financial security protocols operated. She knew that high-security private crypto accounts required two-factor authentication to trigger an emergency password reset. Just typing in a password wasn't going to cut it anymore. The banking application was demanding Eleanor's physical biometric fingerprint to bypass the frozen security wall and release the stolen funds. Chloe had slipped into this intensive care unit for no other reason than to physically violate a comatose woman to steal her money all over again. I watched through the thick observation glass as she set the digital tablet down on the edge of the mattress. She bent over and roughly grabbed my wife's right hand. She treated Eleanor with zero care or basic human dignity. She crudely yanked Eleanor's limp arm toward the glowing screen, completely ignoring the fact that the IV lines were securely taped to Eleanor's fragile, pale skin. I could see the frantic desperation on Chloe's face. She gritted her teeth and slammed Eleanor's thumb directly onto the small, glass scanning pad of the tablet. The screen flashed a vibrant red, indicating a failed scan. Chloe let out a highly frustrated, angry gasp and tried to press the thumb down even harder, bending my wife's fragile finger backward at a painful, completely unnatural angle. I didn't call hospital security. I didn't rush into the room like a madman to throw her away. I simply reached out, pushed open the heavy wooden door, and walked inside, letting the metal latch click softly behind me. That quiet, mechanical sound echoed like a thunderclap in the silent, isolated room. To Chloe's highly strung nerves, it might as well have been a gunshot. She let out a sharp gasp, dropping Eleanor's arm instantly. The heavy digital tablet slipped from her trembling hands, landing face down on the thin hospital blanket. She spun around violently to face me, her eyes stretched incredibly wide with pure, absolute terror. Her chest heaved. She tried desperately to force that fake, sugary sweet daughter-in-law smile back onto her face, but the muscles in her cheeks were twitching uncontrollably from raw panic. "Oh, Arthur," she stammered, taking a clumsy step back from the metal bed frame. "You scared me. I just wanted to come in and check on her while you went to get coffee. Her poor hands felt so cold lying there. I was just trying to rub her fingers to get some warmth back into them. This hospital room is freezing, don't you think?" I didn't answer her right away. I walked slowly and deliberately across the small room. I didn't look at the black digital tablet resting silently on the blanket. I stared straight into her eyes, which were filled with fear and lies. I let the disguise of the weak, confused elderly uncle drop completely, if only for a fraction of a second. I squared my shoulders, pulled my spine straight, and stood at my full height. I let her see the cold, calculating forensic auditor standing right in front of her, someone whose intellect was far beyond her own. "Nee must be extremely careful with her hands, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping into a low, chilling whisper that barely carried over the steady hiss of the ventilator. "Her skin is incredibly fragile right now. Any sudden aggressive pressure or any accidental violent trauma will leave a permanent mark, just like the accidental violent trauma that landed her in this hospital bed in the first place." Chloe swallowed hard, her throat visibly moving up and down. The fake sweet smile melted completely off her pale face, leaving nothing but pure, unadulterated dread. She stopped breathing, freezing for a long, agonizing second. In that exact moment, she realized I wasn't a foolish, blind old man. She realized I knew exactly what had happened on the terracotta tiles of my sunroom. She realized I knew about the acid, and she knew I knew about the blood. I took a step closer to her, forcing her to back up slowly until her spine hit the cold, painted wall of the hospital room. "You know, Chloe," I continued, maintaining an absolutely flat, conversational tone, "I've spent my entire career auditing the foundations of massive structures. I know exactly how heavy, fraudulent ledgers collapse under pressure. When a foundation is built entirely on a massive lie, it never just cracks quietly. It shatters completely and violently, and anyone foolish enough to be standing inside that corrupt structure gets crushed under the immense weight." I slowly bent down and picked up the digital biometric tablet from the white blanket. I very carefully wiped the smooth glass screen against the sleeve of my cardigan sweater, completely erasing her frantic fingerprints. I handed the heavy device back to her, pressing it firmly against her chest. "I think it's time for you to leave this room, Chloe," I whispered, staring straight into her dark, terrified soul. "I think you should go find your husband, and I think you both should prepare yourselves for a total collapse. Because when the heavy stones finally start falling from the sky, there will be absolutely nowhere left for either of you to hide." Chloe snatched the black hardware wallet from my hands, her fingers shaking so violently she almost dropped it onto the floor. She didn't say a single word. She couldn't. The psychological terror embedded in my warning had completely paralyzed her vocal cords. She turned on her heel and practically fled from the intensive care unit, running out of the quiet room as if escaping a burning building. I watched her run down the brightly lit hospital corridor until she vanished around the corner. Slowly, I turned back to my wife. I gently took her right hand, carefully adjusting the IV lines that Chloe had so recklessly disturbed. I massaged her cold fingers, tenderly restoring the circulation in her hand. The trap was now fully live, and the psychological pressure was at an absolute breaking point. Julian believed he was about to become a millionaire, while Chloe knew they were both standing on the precipice of a terrifying abyss. The final execution was going to be absolutely flawless. I knew exactly what was unfolding downtown at that very moment. While I was quietly holding my wife's hand at the hospital, Julian was pushing through the heavy revolving glass doors of the city's most prestigious commercial real estate firm. He was wearing his absolute best custom-tailored suit. He had spent an hour perfectly styling his hair, and his expensive leather shoes were shined to a mirror finish. He strode right past the massive marble reception desk, his chest puffed out, feeling like a true titan of industry. He genuinely believed he had outsmarted every single person in his life. He thought he had beaten the violent loan sharks and completely manipulated his foolish, elderly uncle. As a young receptionist guided him down the carpeted hallway toward the main executive boardroom, he felt absolutely invincible. The boardroom was an imposing space, specifically designed to make ordinary people feel small, but Julian felt like he owned the entire building. A massive polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room. Seated on one side were the three wealthy corporate developers behind the Silicon Valley Tech Campus project. They were serious men in dark suits who had zero time for amateur investors. Sitting at the head of the long table was the senior escrow agent, a stone-faced older man wearing thick glasses. Julian confidently took his seat across from the developers. He placed his expensive leather briefcase on the table, clicking open the latches with authority. He slid out his gold fountain pen, placing it carefully next to a thick stack of closing contracts. The senior escrow agent cleared his throat and opened his laptop. Looking up over the rim of his heavy frames, he addressed the room in a dry, professional tone. He stated that all preliminary background checks were complete and the commercial zoning permits were fully approved. The final step to finalize this massive property transfer was verifying the incoming $600,000 wire transfer from Julian's private lending institution. Julian let out a wide, incredibly arrogant smile. He leaned back in his heavy leather chair, bringing his fingertips together in a pose of manufactured confidence. He told the escrow agent to go right ahead and refresh the banking portal, boasting that his private lender had already confirmed the release of the funds early that morning. The escrow agent typed a secure password into his laptop and hit enter. Dead silence blanketed the room for a few agonizing seconds. The agent slowly nodded his head, his eyes locked on the glowing screen. He announced that a wire transfer in the exact amount of $600,000 had indeed just arrived successfully in the firm's primary escrow account. Julian let out a long, slow exhale of absolute victory and relief. He reached out and picked up his gold fountain pen, preparing to sign his name on the legally binding closing documents. He looked across the table at the wealthy developers, expecting them to reach out and shake his hand in a show of respect for their new partner. But the escrow agent didn't slide the final contracts across the mahogany table. Instead, the older man's eyebrows knit together in a deep frown. He leaned closer to the computer screen, his eyes narrowing in complete confusion. He tapped a few more keys, his professional demeanor rapidly shifting into deep concern. He looked up from the screen, staring directly at Julian. The agent stated that there was a major, highly significant legal discrepancy within the funding routing instructions attached to the incoming wire. A faint, icy spike of panic shot through Julian's stomach, but he maintained his arrogant smirk. He waved his hand dismissively, telling the agent it was likely just a small clerical error on the shadow lender's part. He demanded the agent print the final signature pages so they could finalize the deal and start celebrating. The senior escrow agent slowly shook his head. "This is not a small clerical error, Mr. Julian," the agent said, his voice dropping into a stern, dead serious tone. "The clearinghouse routing numbers match our firm perfectly, but the legally binding beneficiary name on this massive wire transfer does not belong to your commercial holding company. In fact, it explicitly bars your company from touching a single penny of these funds." The three wealthy developers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The lead developer narrowed his eyes, demanding the escrow agent explain exactly what was going on. The gold fountain pen slipped from Julian's fingers, clattering loudly against the mahogany table. His heart began to beat at a frantic, erratic pace. He slammed his hands down and leaned forward, aggressively demanding to know whose name was on that wire transfer. The escrow agent turned the laptop screen slightly so everyone in the room could see the official banking documentation. The agent read the strict, legally enforced directive attached directly to the wire by the authorizing trustee. He announced to the silent room that the $600,000 was permanently restricted and legally assigned to an irrevocable donor-advised fund dedicated to funding underprivileged education. He read the attached legal rider aloud. The funds were strictly earmarked for a public charitable trust. Using them for any private commercial development or personal financial gain was absolutely illegal. Furthermore, the agent noted, this transfer had been permanently locked by the trust's legal custodian, a man named Marcus. Every single drop of color drained from Julian's face, leaving him looking like a pale, terrified ghost. The walls of the massive executive boardroom suddenly felt like they were closing in on him at 1,000 miles an hour. He gripped the edge of the heavy mahogany table, desperately trying to steady his shaking hands. The horrifying truth crashed into his arrogant brain with the physical destruction of a runaway freight train. His uncle was not a confused, helpless old man crying in a hospital hallway. His uncle knew everything. His uncle had somehow discovered the forged farm mortgage power of attorney and intercepted the massive shadow loan. I had deliberately allowed the fraudulent funds to process through the system for the sole purpose of trapping them permanently inside an untouchable charitable trust. The lead developer slammed his fist onto the table, shattering the shocked silence in the room. He stood up, his face flushed red with sudden boiling fury. He looked down at Julian with absolute disgust, accusing him of being a pathetic, penniless amateur con artist who had wasted their valuable corporate time playing stupid financial games. The developer ordered the escrow agent to terminate the transaction immediately and officially void the partnership contracts. The three wealthy businessmen packed up their briefcases and stormed out of the boardroom without looking back, leaving the heavy glass doors swinging violently behind them. Julian sat frozen in his leather chair, completely unable to speak or move. His entire lavish lifestyle had evaporated into thin air in less than 2 minutes. He had absolutely no commercial real estate deal. He had $0 in his frozen bank accounts, and he had just successfully committed massive federal bank fraud by mortgaging a family farm he didn't own to a group of ruthless shadow lenders. And the terrifying 24-hour deadline Victor had given him in that dark parking garage was rapidly ticking away. The senior escrow agent closed his laptop with a loud, sharp snap. He looked at Julian with cold, professional contempt. The agent informed Julian that he was legally obligated to report this major funding anomaly to the State Financial Regulation Board. He told Julian to pack up his things and leave the premises immediately. Julian stood up slowly, his legs trembling so hard they could barely support his own weight. He reached out blindly, grabbed his gold fountain pen, and threw it absent-mindedly into his briefcase. He stumbled out of the executive boardroom, his feet dragging heavily across the long carpeted hallway. He felt completely numb. He pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped onto the busy downtown sidewalk. The bright afternoon sun stung his eyes. Desperately, he scanned both sides of the crowded street. He spotted a black sedan idling illegally at the corner, sitting directly across from his own luxury electric car. Two burly men in immaculate dark-tailored suits were leaning against the hood, watching him with dead, freezing eyes. Victor and his collectors had arrived exactly on time, just as they had promised. The absolute crushing weight of total destruction finally settled onto Julian's shoulders, and he realized with terrifying clarity that there was absolutely nowhere left for him to run. I sat in the dim corner of my living room, monitoring the security camera feeds on my tablet. I sat completely still in my heavy armchair, surrounded entirely by the shadows. The house was dead quiet, but I knew that a massive storm was rapidly approaching my front door. Julian had somehow managed to ditch the two collectors waiting for him outside his downtown office. He'd probably slipped through a basement service elevator and run like a hunted animal through the dirty back alleys of the city. He had driven like a madman back to his luxury apartment, staying just long enough to grab Chloe before fleeing into the night, minutes before Victor's thugs kicked their door off its hinges. They had absolutely nowhere else to go. They'd burned every single bridge and maxed out every possible line of credit. The only place left for them to run was the one spot they thought still held tangible physical wealth. They were coming to rob the very house they had just failed to mortgage. The bright headlights of Julian's luxury sedan suddenly cut through the darkness of my front lawn. He didn't even bother pulling into the paved driveway. He aggressively jumped the concrete curb, parking the vehicle directly on the grass behind the massive oak trees, desperately trying to hide the car from the main street. The heavy car doors slammed shut with a deep, echoing thud. Through the thick glass windows of the front living room, I watched my nephew and his wife sprint across the damp lawn. They were completely unhinged. Chloe was crying hysterically, tripping over her expensive designer heels in the wet grass. Julian was roughly dragging her by the arm, his face twisted into a mask of pure wild panic. They reached the wooden front porch, gasping for air. Julian didn't even try to fumble through his pockets for a spare key. His hands were shaking so violently that he just grabbed the heavy brass handle and threw his entire shoulder into the solid walnut front door. It burst open instantly. I had purposely left it unlocked for them. They tumbled into the dark hallway, completely losing their balance. Julian leaned against the painted wall to steady himself, panting like a drowning man, while Chloe collapsed onto her knees, right on the polished hardwood floor, sobbing uncontrollably. She begged Julian to tell her what they were going to do, screaming that Victor's men were going to find them tonight and kill them both. Julian harshly told her to shut up and get off the floor. He ordered her to go straight to the kitchen and grab any silver she could find, telling her they needed anything they could immediately melt down or pawn for fast cash. He said he was going straight upstairs to the master bedroom. He told Chloe he knew exactly where his aunt hid her heavy diamond jewelry and vintage gold necklaces. He also mentioned the heavy steel safe hidden behind the large oil painting in my study, breathing heavily as he bragged that he had secretly seen me enter the 4-digit combination years ago. He honestly believed that grabbing a handful of old diamonds and whatever emergency cash I kept in that safe would be enough to buy them a one-way ticket out of the country. He believed he could pillage our home, vanish into the night, and leave his adoptive mother fighting for her life in a sterile hospital bed, while he ran far away from the violent consequences of his own debts. I sat completely still in the dark living room, listening to the heavy, chaotic thud of their footsteps thundering up the wooden stairs. The absolute, blatant disrespect for this house made me physically sick. I heard Julian kick the master bedroom door open with a violent crash. I heard the heavy wooden dresser drawers being ripped out and thrown brutally onto the floor. I heard the frantic tearing of fabric as he tore through Eleanor's neatly organized closet, destroying her sacred personal space to find her velvet jewelry boxes. He was acting like a common street thug, stripped of any basic human dignity or moral restraint. Down the hall, I heard Chloe frantically tearing through the wooden kitchen cabinets. Glass plates shattered against the granite countertops as she blindly hunted for the heavy silverware we only used on special family holidays. The beautiful, warm home that Eleanor and I had spent 40 years building with love and care was being violently pillaged by the two people we had spent our entire adult lives trying to protect and nurture. It was a pathetic, desperate display of total ruin. Upstairs, the frantic crashing stopped abruptly. A heavy, chilling silence fell over the second floor. A moment later, I heard Julian let out a loud, guttural roar of pure, agonizing frustration. I knew exactly what he had just discovered. He had ripped the large landscape painting off the wall of my study, revealing the heavy steel door of the hidden safe. He had desperately entered the 4-digit security code he'd memorized all those years ago. He had pulled down on the heavy metal lever, expecting to find thick stacks of emergency cash reserves and valuable bearer bonds. But the safe was entirely empty. With Marcus's explicit assistance, I had cleared every single item of value out of this house hours ago. The vintage gold necklaces, the heavy diamond rings, and the emergency cash reserves were all sitting safely inside an impenetrable bank vault on the other side of town. The velvet jewelry boxes in Eleanor's closet were empty. There was absolutely nothing of monetary value left in this house for them to steal. I heard heavy, chaotic footsteps rushing down the wooden stairs. Julian was taking them 2 at a time, his breathing heavy and incredibly ragged. He burst back into the main hallway, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. Chloe ran out of the kitchen, her hands shaking violently, holding nothing but a single silver soup spoon. She looked at Julian with wide, terrified eyes, asking him where the jewelry was, asking if he got the emergency cash from the safe. Julian leaned heavily against the wooden banister and slowly slid down to the bottom step. He stared blankly into the empty, dark hallway, slowly shaking his head, his eyes stretched wide and completely dead inside. He whispered that it was all gone. He told her the safe was completely empty, and that someone had already cleared out his mother's jewelry boxes. The bare, terrifying reality finally hit them with the crushing weight of a collapsing building. There was no secret fund. There was no family jewelry left to pawn. There was absolutely no way to escape the violent debt collectors hunting them through the city streets. They sat there in the dark hallway, utterly defeated and broken by their own bottomless greed. They had absolutely nothing left to steal, and absolutely nowhere left to run. It was the perfect moment to turn on the living room lights. I reached out and clicked the small brass button on the heavy reading lamp next to my leather armchair. A warm yellow light suddenly flooded the dark living room and spilled over into the hallway. Julian and Chloe winced violently, throwing their hands up to block the sudden piercing glare. They scrambled backward against the polished hardwood floor, like cornered animals caught in the high beams of an oncoming semi-truck. When their eyes finally adjusted to the light, the look of pure, unadulterated horror that washed over their pale faces was an image I will remember for the rest of my life. I was sitting completely still in my favorite armchair, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I was no longer the confused, broken old man crying in a hospital hallway. I sat perfectly straight, staring at them with eyes as cold and hard as solid concrete, and I wasn't alone in the room. Marcus was standing quietly by the heavy stone fireplace, holding his thick leather briefcase in his right hand. His face was a mask of pure professional contempt. Standing quietly near the front door, completely blocking their only physical exit, was a tall, broad-shouldered man in a dark, casual suit. A second, equally imposing man was leaning casually against the archway leading to the kitchen. They weren't private security guards. They were two senior investigators from the State Police Homicide Unit and a federal agent. For the past 20 minutes, they had been standing completely still in the shadows, listening to every single frantic, desperate word my nephew and his wife had shouted while violently tearing my home apart. Julian pushed himself up from the floor, his legs shaking so badly that his knees were actually knocking together. His arrogant brain was desperately scrambling to construct a plausible lie to explain why he had just kicked in the door of his childhood home and destroyed his mother's bedroom. He took a trembling step forward, trying to force a sick, reassuring smile onto his sweat-drenched face. "Uncle," he stammered, all the real confidence completely drained from his voice. "What are you doing sitting here in the dark? We came over because we needed to find Aunt Eleanor's important medical insurance paperwork. We were just looking for the documents to help pay for the hospital bills. I'm so sorry about the mess. We were just so panicked about her health." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even get up from my comfortable chair. I just looked at the silver soup spoon Chloe was still clutching tightly in her trembling hand. "You don't use a silver soup spoon to pay medical bills, Julian," I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any family warmth. "You use a silver spoon to get quick cash at a pawn shop when you're being hunted through the city streets by violent debt collectors. And you use a vintage diamond necklace to buy a one-way ticket out of the country when you've just committed massive federal bank fraud and have absolutely nowhere left to hide." Julian's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at Marcus, and then at the two large men blocking the exit. The absolute crushing reality of his situation finally pierced through his thick layers of denial and arrogance. In that exact second, he realized I knew everything. He realized I knew about the dangerous loan sharks, the failed tech campus deal, and the supposedly frozen bank accounts. He slowly turned his gaze back to me, his eyes stretching wide with a new, terrifying comprehension. He finally realized that the card rejections at the hospital cafeteria had never been an automated system glitch. He realized that I had personally cut his financial throat and quietly watched him bleed out. Chloe broke into loud, gasping sobs, dropping the silver spoon onto the floor. It hit the wood with a sharp, metallic clang that sounded deafening in the tense silence of the room. She collapsed onto her knees, entirely broken by the overwhelming presence of the investigators. She looked up at Julian, begging him to do something, begging him to fix the massive catastrophe he had dragged her into. But there was nothing Julian could do. He had been completely stripped of his power, his stolen money, and his desperate lies. I looked at the boy I had raised, the boy I had sacrificed the best years of my life to protect and provide for, and I saw absolutely nothing of myself in him. I saw only an empty, greedy shell of a man who was willing to physically destroy his own adoptive mother, just to taste a fleeting moment of false corporate status. Marcus stepped forward, unbuckling his heavy leather briefcase and placing a thick stack of official legal documents down on my coffee table. He looked down at Julian with a cold, clinically surgical precision. "Mr. Julian," Marcus said, his sharp voice cutting right through Chloe's loud, gasping sobs. "You have been incredibly busy over the last 24 hours. You attempted to violently grand larceny $500,000 from your aunt's private investment account. You successfully forged a trust modification deed and a digital medical power of attorney. And then you fraudulently collateralized a piece of property you don't legally own to secure a commercial bridge loan from a highly dangerous group of shadow lenders." Marcus tapped the thick stack of papers with his index finger. "We have the complete digital transaction logs, the forged signature packets, and a sworn affidavit from your corrupt digital notary." The tall investigator standing by the front door took a slow, deliberate step forward into the living room. The heavy silence in the house was completely suffocating now, pressing down on Julian like the weight of a collapsing bridge. He was backed into a corner he had built with his own two hands, entirely surrounded by the inescapable legal and financial consequences of his violent greed. He stared down at the floor, completely unable to meet my eyes. He was no longer the wealthy tech park developer or the high-powered corporate executive. He was just a pathetic, desperate criminal waiting for the heavy iron doors of justice to permanently slam shut around him. The trap I had meticulously engineered was officially closed, and there was absolutely nothing left for him to do but confess. I leaned forward slightly in my armchair and picked up the first piece of paper from the stack Marcus had left on the coffee table. I held it up, letting the bright living room lights illuminate the bold black ink. "This is the printed transaction log from your aunt's private trust account," I said, my voice incredibly steady, completely stripped of emotion. "It shows an highly unauthorized wire transfer for $500,000, initiated exactly 1 full hour before an ambulance was ever called to this house. You thought you were so incredibly smart, Julian. You thought that with temporary administrative access, you could drain her life savings to buy your way into that Silicon Valley tech campus deal. But you didn't realize I have a private wealth manager who monitors every single large-scale transaction on our accounts. While you were sipping your expensive iced coffee, I made a single phone call from a hospital stairwell and completely froze the entire family network. That's why your cards were declined at the cafeteria. It was never an automated system glitch, Julian. It was me, completely cutting off your oxygen." Julian stared at the piece of paper, his entire body trembling violently. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, watching the ground beneath his feet rapidly dissolve. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the printed transaction log. It was the physical proof that his entire timeline was a massive, easily debunked lie. I placed the transaction log back on the table and picked up the second document. This was the paper that truly locked in his absolute destruction. "This is a copy of the digital power of attorney you submitted to those private shadow lenders late last night," I continued, my voice echoing sharply in the quiet room. "You actually found a corrupt notary willing to risk federal prison to stamp a forged document. You falsely claimed I was mentally incompetent, and you fluidly forged my signature on the bottom line. You did all of this to secure a $600,000 commercial bridge loan against this family farm. You honestly believed you could steal my inherited land to pay off your debts to the mob." Chloe let out a sharp, incredibly pathetic wail, She covered her face with her trembling hands, rocking back and forth on her knees. The reality of federal forgery charges was swallowing her whole. "But you made a massive, catastrophic mistake, Julian," I said, leaning in closer, resting my elbows on my knees. "You assumed I was just a retired old man who didn't understand complex financial law. You thought this farm was just sitting here completely unprotected, waiting for you to steal its massive equity. You looked at the family that raised you, and all you saw was a massive pile of cash to fund your arrogant lifestyle." I looked straight into his terror-filled eyes, delivering the final crushing blow. "I don't own that farm, Julian. 5 years ago, your aunt and I transferred the entire physical deed of that property into an irrevocable charitable trust. Marcus is the sole legal custodian of that entire estate." Julian stopped breathing. His jaw dropped completely flat. The gears in his arrogant brain finally seized up in absolute horror as he tried to process the terrifying severity of the mistake he had just made. He looked up at Marcus and then back at me, his mind completely refusing to accept the absolute impossibility of his situation. I explained the precise mechanics of the trap I had built for him in incredibly simple, slow words, ensuring he could fully grasp the depth of his own ruin. I told him that when his private lender submitted the title verification request this morning, Marcus didn't block it. I told him I explicitly ordered Marcus to approve the fraudulent loan. "I wanted the shadow lenders to process your massive request," I said, watching absolute despair wash over his pale face. "But Marcus legally mandated that the incoming funds be wired directly into a charitable escrow account. So when you received that glorious digital approval message on your phone today, the money never actually went to your commercial holding company. Those $600,000 were completely swallowed by the charitable trust." I let that terrifying reality hang in the air for a long, silent second. The two plainclothes investigators stood perfectly still, watching the psychological execution unfold with cold, professional interest. "Do you understand exactly what you did today, Julian?" I demanded, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper. "You successfully committed massive federal bank fraud. You intentionally collateralized a property you do not legally own to secure a commercial loan from incredibly dangerous people. The shadow lenders legally released the funds, so you now owe them $600,000, plus exorbitant weekly interest. But because that money went directly into my untouchable charitable trust, your massive criminal effort earned you an absolute $0. You marched into your commercial real estate closing today with empty pockets and a mountain of federal felonies. You are completely broke. You owe a massive debt to violent loan sharks, and you are sitting in a room with two senior detectives who have a complete paper trail of your entire fraudulent career." Julian collapsed forward, catching himself on his hands and knees. He looked exactly like a puppet whose strings had been violently severed. He stared blankly at the polished hardwood floor, gasping for air in short, ragged bursts. His illusion of a powerful, wealthy life had shattered into a million unfixable pieces. He wasn't a corporate titan. He wasn't a tech billionaire. He was just a terrified, desperate little boy who tried to rob his own adoptive parents and ruined his own life in the process. His breathing became incredibly fast and shallow as a severe panic attack seized his entire body. Chloe grabbed Julian by the arm, shaking him violently. She was completely hysterical now, her voice turning into a piercing shriek of pure, unfiltered terror. "Tell them it's a lie, Julian," she screamed, her face bright red and smeared with panicked tears. "Tell them we can fix it. Victor is going to find us. He's going to kill us both tonight. You have to give the money back to the lenders. You have to cancel the loan right now. You have to make them reverse the wire, Julian." Marcus stepped forward, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the wood floor. He looked down at Chloe with absolute ice-cold professional disgust. "You cannot cancel a fully processed shadow loan, Mrs. Chloe," Marcus said, his voice freezing and precise. "The funds are legally locked inside a charitable foundation. It is completely untouchable. Your husband successfully defrauded a federal financial institution in a private lending syndicate at the exact same time. There is absolutely no legal mechanism to reverse this transaction. The money is gone, and that massive violent debt belongs to you permanently. You stole from people who never forgive, and you have absolutely nothing left to pay them back. I lean back in my comfortable armchair, completely satisfied by the total structural collapse of their lives. I had methodically stripped away every single layer of their false security. I took their stolen money. I took their fraudulent loan. I took their tech park dreams, and I took their absolute freedom. They walked into my home expecting to find a weak, easy target. Instead, they marched straight into a perfectly engineered financial meat grinder. They had absolutely nothing left. But financial ruin was only the first part of my final equation. The money was simply the necessary bait to corner them. I wanted them completely stripped of resources and entirely terrified of the violent collectors waiting outside. However, the real crime, the absolute unforgivable betrayal, still needed to be answered for. I looked down the hallway toward the back of the house, where my wife's blood was still soaked deep into the porous dirt and terracotta tiles of the sunroom. I knew that the immense pressure of total bankruptcy would finally snap the last remaining bond between them. I knew that under the weight of the massive, terrifying truth, one of them was about to break. The investigators waited patiently in the shadows, knowing the interrogation was effectively over and that the final confession was seconds away. The silence in the living room was dead, broken only by the sound of Julian gasping for air on the hardwood floor. He was experiencing a complete physical breakdown right in front of me. The realization of total ruin and being actively hunted by the mob had entirely broken his nervous system. Chloe was still clutching his arm, shaking him and begging him to fix a catastrophe that was completely impossible to fix. I wouldn't have to lift a single finger to watch them tear each other apart. But the financial execution was simply the cornerstone of my plan. It was time for the entire structure to come crashing down on their heads. I slowly stood up from my comfortable armchair. My joints ached slightly, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I stepped around the edge of the heavy wooden coffee table and stood directly over my trembling nephew. I ordered him to look at me. I ordered him to lift his head and look his adoptive father in the eye. Julian slowly raised his pale, sweat-drenched face. His eyes were completely vacant, entirely stripped of any of the arrogant swagger he had brought into this house. I raised a steady finger, pointing toward the dark hallway that led to the sunroom at the back of the house. I told him I hadn't spent my entire life building an impenetrable financial fortress, just to watch a stupid, greedy boy tear it down piece by piece. I explained that the very second I walked through my front door yesterday and smelled that pungent reek of industrial muriatic acid, I knew exactly what he had done. I told him about the high-powered forensic UV flashlight I kept in my equipment case down in the basement. I told him how I had swept that deep purple beam across the antique terracotta tiles, and I explained how the floor lit up with a manic, neon blue glow from the chemical residue, while the heavy, porous dirt and the deep crevices between the tiles completely swallowed the purple light. I told him I saw the jagged, pitch-black void hidden deep within the organic soil, the thick stain of human blood that his frantic scrubbing could never reach. Chloe stopped shaking her husband's arm. She froze completely, her eyes darting wildly between my face and the dark hallway leading to the sunroom. Her breathing turned incredibly shallow. She realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that a $500,000 bank fraud was no longer their biggest problem. I looked straight down at her. I told her the federal government was going to seize every single asset they owned to repay that fraudulent bridge loan. I told her Victor and his collectors were likely idling in their dark car right at the end of our street this very second. And I told her that when the police formally charged them with the attempted murder of Eleanor, the state prosecutor would demand the absolute maximum prison sentence for both of them. I let the words "both of them" echo heavily through the quiet room. I told her the law rarely showed mercy to violent, greedy criminals, but sometimes the first person to speak the absolute truth might end up with a slightly smaller cell. I planted the seed of total betrayal directly into her terrified mind. I knew her survival instinct was infinitely greater than any loyalty to her marriage. The silence in the room stretched tight, like a heavy steel cable wrapped to its breaking point, ready to snap. Julian reached out a weak, trembling hand, grabbing his wife's arm. He whispered her name, begging her to keep her mouth shut. He told her I had no real physical proof, that I was just an old man trying to scare them, but his voice was pathetic, hollow, and completely broken. Chloe looked down at his shaking hand, and then looked toward the terrifying dark shadows near the front door, where the two large men stood in total silence. The crushing weight of a federal prison sentence, the violent reality of the Russian loan sharks, and her absolute financial ruin finally broke her spirit completely. She violently ripped her hand out of his grip. She pushed herself away, scrambling backward across the polished hardwood floor as if he were a highly contagious, deadly disease. She pointed a shaking finger straight at his chest. Her voice burst into a loud, hysterical scream that shattered the silence of the house. She shrieked that it was all his fault. She screamed that she never wanted to hurt anyone, that she was only following his sick, twisted orders. The confession poured out of her in a frantic, breathless rush of terrifying details. She told the room that Eleanor had discovered the unauthorized bank transfer on her tablet and had threatened to call the police immediately. She screamed that Julian completely lost his mind when Eleanor firmly and bravely refused to let him steal the money for his Silicon Valley tech campus deal. Chloe sobbed loudly, claiming Julian had grabbed the incredibly heavy cast-iron garden trowel from the iron racks. She said he swung it frantically, using brutal physical force to push the woman who had raised him as her own. She described the horrific, sickening sound my wife's head made when it slammed against the sharp edge of the metal plant stands. She screamed that Eleanor collapsed onto the floor, completely unresponsive, bleeding heavily onto the terracotta tiles. Chloe wept uncontrollably, admitting that Julian had forced her to run to the kitchen and grab the high-concentration muriatic acid cleaner from under the sink. She said he threatened to leave her alone to face the violent loan sharks if she didn't help him scrub the floors before calling 911. She cried out that they spent an entire hour scrubbing the tiles, while Eleanor lay motionless in the middle of the room, bleeding out. She confessed that the fake story about slipping in the sunroom and hitting the radiator was entirely manufactured by Julian, designed solely to cover up his brutal crime. Julian collapsed entirely, burying his face directly into the hardwood floor. He let out a long, agonizing, guttural wail of total, absolute defeat. The absolute truth was out in the open, and there was no way to push it back into the dark. I looked at Marcus and gave a slow, deliberate nod. The financial trap had successfully starved out the rats, and the psychological pressure had finally forced them to crawl out into the blinding light of justice. Marcus stepped back, turning his attention toward the front hallway. The two broad-shouldered men in plain clothes slowly emerged from the shadows. They walked methodically into the center of the bright living room, their heavy shoes making dull, thudding sounds against the wood floor. The lead investigator reached into the pocket of his dark jacket and pulled out a heavy pair of silver handcuffs. The sharp, metallic clinking sound was the most beautiful music I had heard in days. The two detectives had been standing patiently in my hallway for nearly an hour, waiting for the absolute probable cause required to make a lawful physical arrest. That frantic, hyper-detailed confession was the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle. The lead detective bent down, firmly grabbing the back of Julian's expensive custom suit jacket. He effortlessly hoisted my nephew up from the hardwood floor. Julian hung limply in the officer's grip, looking exactly like a broken rag doll. The detective stared straight into Julian's hollow eyes, reading him his rights in a cold, professional cadence. He stated that Julian had the right to remain silent, but that everything he had just done and said would be used against him in a court of law. He declared that Julian was officially under arrest for felony federal bank fraud, grand larceny, forgery, and the attempted murder of Eleanor. The second detective stepped up next to Chloe, roughly pulling her up from the floor. He pinned her arms behind her back, clicking a heavy set of iron cuffs around her wrists. She continued to sob hysterically, her tears completely ruining her expensive makeup, crying out to the detective that she was just an innocent victim of her violent husband. I stood in the center of my living room, watching the two officers drag my nephew and his wife toward the front door. Julian didn't fight back. His feet dragged uselessly against the floor, his posture completely hollowed out and ruined. I thought about my 40 years of work as a forensic auditor. I had spent a lifetime learning that structures built on corrupt, fragile foundations inevitably cave in under their own weight. Julian had built his entire adult life on a foundation of massive greed, entitlement, and violent lies. He had gambled with his adoptive mother's life just to taste a fleeting moment of false corporate power, and he had lost absolutely everything. The financial audit was complete, and the physical execution was officially over. They were walking out of my front door to face decades inside a concrete federal prison cell. They would never set foot inside my home ever again. Victor and his debt collectors would strip away whatever physical property they had left, and the federal government would take the rest of their natural lives. The heavy walnut front door shut firmly behind them, locking the chaos of the night outside. The house suddenly felt incredibly clean and perfectly quiet. I turned to Marcus, thanking him for executing a flawless legal execution. The storm was finally over, and it was time for me to go back to the hospital and sit by my wife's side. The heavy steel handcuffs locked around Julian's wrists with a sharp, echoing snap of absolute finality. The lead detective kept a firm, unyielding grip on the back of Julian's custom collar, physically supporting his weight since his legs had completely given out beneath him. He dragged his expensive leather shoes across the polished hardwood floor, leaving dull scuff marks on the exact wood where he had tried to scrub away his mother's blood. He didn't say a word. His chin rested heavily against his chest, his eyes staring blankly into nothingness. He looked entirely hollowed out, like a building that had been completely demolished from the inside. Chloe, on the other hand, was fighting a desperate, losing battle against the second detective. She twisted her shoulders and kicked her designer heels wildly, trying to break free from the iron grip holding her arms. She was crying so hard she was choking on her own breath, begging the detective, telling him she was a respected corporate founder who couldn't be seen in handcuffs. The detective completely ignored her pathetic cries, firmly guiding her toward the dark hallway. I stood quietly by the stone fireplace, watching them take that long, agonizing walk toward the front door. This was the house where Julian grew up. These were the walls that had protected him, and these were the floors where he had played as a child. He had walked through these rooms thousands of times, taking it for granted that everything inside belonged to him. Now he was being forcibly marched out of his childhood home as a violent criminal. The lead detective reached out and threw open the heavy walnut front door. A cool night breeze rushed into the suffocating living room, bringing a sudden, sharp clarity to the air. Out on the quiet suburban street, 3 marked police cruisers were idling, their red and blue emergency lights painting the manicured lawns in flashing, chaotic colors. 2 uniformed officers stood tall and imposing on our front porch, waiting in the dark. The entire neighborhood had been woken up. I could see the silhouettes of our neighbors standing out on their own porches, watching this wealthy, arrogant tech developer and his perfectly styled wife being dragged across the damp grass in absolute disgrace. The public humiliation was total. Victor and his debt collectors might have broken Julian's body, but the flashing police lights and the staring neighbors completely shattered his vanity. Right before the investigators pushed Julian down the brick steps, my nephew stopped. Slowly, he turned his head back to look at me. I stepped out of the shadows of the living room, standing squarely in the doorway under the warm light of the porch. Julian stared at my face, desperately searching for a single ounce of fatherly compassion. He was looking for the man who had always bailed him out whenever he got into trouble as an arrogant teenager. He was praying to see a soft-hearted, grieving old man who might eventually forgive him and pay for an expensive defense attorney. I gave him absolutely nothing. I stood there with a straight back and a blank face, looking at him like a stone statue. I wasn't looking at him as a father looking at a son. I was looking at him as an auditor, looking at a defective piece of scrap material that needed to be permanently discarded. He saw the ice-cold, absolute finality in my eyes, and a fresh wave of tears finally spilled down his pale cheeks. He turned his head away, letting the investigators drag him down the steps and across the wet lawn toward the waiting cruiser. The uniformed officers took custody of Chloe, roughly pushing her head down as she was forced into the hard plastic back seat of the second police car. She kicked the frame of the door once before the heavy metal shut, trapping her completely in the dark. Julian was shoved into the lead car, his head resting heavily against the reinforced glass window. The engines roared to life, shattering the peace of our quiet suburban street. The cruisers pulled away from the curb, moving slowly down the road until the flashing lights vanished entirely around the corner. I stood on the porch for a long time, listening to the fading sirens. The toxic, chaotic energy they had brought into our lives was finally gone. I turned around, walked back inside, and shut the heavy walnut front door, locking it securely behind me. I walked into the living room, clicked off the reading lamp, and let the empty space sink back into a peaceful darkness. It was time for me to go back to the hospital. I drove through the quiet city streets, feeling lighter than I had in days. The oppressive weight of the last 24 hours had been completely lifted from my shoulders. I was no longer a general commanding a battlefield. I was just a husband returning to the woman he loved. I parked my truck in the hospital garage, walking right past the exact dark corner where my nephew had faced his violent reckoning just hours before. The concrete walls held no terror for me now. The predators were all locked in cages. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the main lobby and took the elevator up to the intensive care unit on the 3rd floor. At this hour of the morning, the sterile white hallways were perfectly quiet. The sharp scent of alcohol and antiseptic didn't make my stomach turn anymore. It just smelled like a place where healing could happen. I gently pushed open the heavy wooden door to room 312. The space was bathed in the soft blue glow of the medical monitors. I walked over to the stiff plastic chair by the bedside, sat down quietly, and took Eleanor's hand back into mine. For the first time since I found her, I didn't need to distract myself. I didn't have to calculate legal maneuvers or guard against violent retaliation. I could just sit here and pour every ounce of my love and energy into being there for her recovery. About an hour later, the chief neurologist stepped into the room. He was holding a digital tablet and wearing a small, tired smile. He looked at the glowing monitors, then down at me, and delivered the exact news I had been praying for. He said the severe swelling inside her brain had completely stopped. The intracranial pressure had dropped back down into a perfectly normal, safe zone. The worst of the medical crisis had been successfully bridged. He told me her body was incredibly resilient, and it was time to let her breathe on her own. I leaned against the wall, watching the medical team carefully remove the thick plastic breathing tube from her throat. The loud mechanical hiss that had dominated the room for so long finally stopped. In its place was the faint, natural sound of my wife breathing on her own. I sat back down in my chair and waited. I watched the morning sun slowly climb outside the hospital window, casting a warm golden light across the white blanket. Her fingers gave a tiny twitch inside my palm. I leaned close to her face, calling her name over and over in a soft whisper. Her eyelids fluttered, fighting against the heavy sedatives. Slowly and painfully she opened her eyes. At first they couldn't focus, staring blankly at the ceiling. Then she turned her head just a fraction of an inch, and her beautiful eyes found my face. A tear cut through the wrinkles on my cheek, dropping softly onto the sheet. She tried to swallow, but her throat was dry from the long intubation. I quickly reached over, poured a small cup of warm water, and pressed a small sponge against her lips so she could sip. She let out a long, shaky sigh. The confusion in her eyes was slowly replaced by memory. I could see the exact terrifying moment she remembered what happened in the sunroom. Her body tensed up. Her heart monitor began to beep frantically. She gripped my hand with surprising strength, her eyes stretching wide with pure terror. "Julian," she whispered, her voice incredibly hoarse. "The money, Arthur. He wanted the money. He grabbed the trowel." I gently placed my other hand over hers, calming her frantic trembling. I leaned down to kiss her bandaged forehead, resting my cheek against her warm skin. "I'm here, Eleanor," I said, my voice thick with emotion but completely steady and calm. "I'm right here, and you are absolutely safe. No one is ever going to hurt you again." She looked at me desperately, searching my face for the truth. "He tried to force me to unlock the transfer." She wept softly, tears welling in her eyes. "I refused him. I told him that money was for the charity foundation. He was so angry, Arthur. He looked like a madman. He pushed me. Did he get it? Did he take our savings?" I stroked her gray hair, gently soothing her frayed nerves. "He didn't get a single penny, sweetheart," I whispered softly. "I promised you I would always protect our home, and I kept that promise." I explained what had happened, in very simple, gentle terms, telling her that I discovered the truth the moment I came home. I told her I immediately locked down the accounts and cut off his access to our wealth. I didn't tell her about the violent loan sharks or the forged digital power of attorney. She didn't need the burden of those ugly, dark details right now. She only needed to know that the threat had been completely eliminated. "Where is he?" she asked, her voice trembling with deep sadness and lingering fear. "Where are Julian and Chloe?" I looked deep into her eyes, making sure she understood the absolute finality of my words. "I surgically removed those parasites from our lives, Eleanor," I said firmly. "They are gone. They are currently sitting in a federal holding facility, facing the maximum prison sentences for what they did to you and what they tried to do to our assets. They will never set foot in our home again. They will never ask us for another dollar. The poison has been completely drained from our family tree." Eleanor stared at me for a long time, absorbing the heavy truth. In that quiet hospital room, she mourned the total loss of the boy we had raised as a son. But at the same time, I saw a deep physical sense of relief wash over her tired body. Years of endless manipulation, disrespectful demands for money, and terrifying violence were finally over. She would never have to live in fear inside her own home again. She took a long, shaky breath, closed her eyes, and squeezed my hand tight. "We're safe," she whispered, letting her tears fall freely onto the pillow. "We are absolutely safe," I replied, kissing her hand. The medical monitors slowly calmed down, returning to a steady, peaceful rhythm. The bright morning sun flooded the hospital room, washing away the last shadows of that terrifying night. I sat by her side, listening to the natural sound of her breathing, knowing that the hardest battle was won, and that the rest of our lives finally belonged to us again. 6 months passed like a slow, steady tide. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse felt entirely different from the front door of my house. Today they were the gates of absolute justice. I sat in the front row of the quiet courtroom, holding Eleanor's hand tightly in mine. She looked elegant, wearing a simple blue dress with a silk scarf carefully wrapped around her neck to hide the fading surgical scars. Her recovery had been long and difficult, filled with painful physical therapy and quiet reflection, but she had fought her way back to my side with incredible inner strength. We no longer looked like fragile victims. We looked like resilient survivors who had successfully weathered a massive, terrifying storm. Across the wide aisle, sitting in the heavy wooden defense box, were Julian and Chloe. They were dressed in dull, oversized orange prison jumpsuits. The luxury custom suits, the expensive designer shoes, and the perfectly styled hair were completely gone. They looked small, pale, and utterly broken. "You federal judge" brought his heavy gavel down with a sharp, resounding crack. The loud sound echoed against the high ceiling of the courtroom, bringing a dead silence to the room. The judge showed absolutely zero legal mercy. Looking down from his high bench with immense authority, he delivered a scathing reprimand. He spoke about the sickening nature of their greed and the fundamental, disgusting betrayal of sacred family trust. He officially sentenced Julian to 15 years in a maximum security federal prison with absolutely no possibility of early parole. The combination of grand larceny bank fraud and the attempted murder of his adoptive mother carried a devastating price. Chloe was sentenced to a strict 8 years for her active participation in the financial scams and her desperate, calculated attempt to cover up the violent assault. Chloe began to cry in complete and absolute silence, burying her pale face deep inside her cuffed hands. Her tears were entirely real now, born from total and unadulterated despair rather than her usual sickening manipulation. Julian didn't move a single muscle. He just stared blankly ahead, completely crushed under the immense weight of his own irreversible actions. I watched as the heavily armed federal marshals forcibly led them out through the thick side doors of the courtroom. I felt absolutely zero pity or family mercy for them. I only felt a deep, profound sense of absolute peace, knowing that the wall of security I had built around my wife was now forever impenetrable. We walked out of the freezing federal building and stepped straight into the warm, bright afternoon sun. The air smelled crisp and clean. We drove back to our quiet suburban home, taking a long, scenic route along the beautiful shoreline of Lake Michigan. The house looked exactly as it always had, but the energy within its walls was completely different. It was no longer a target for greedy predators. It was a true, permanent sanctuary. When we walked into the bright kitchen, Marcus was already waiting for us. He had laid out a thick stack of official legal documents neatly on the granite island. He gave us a warm smile and poured 3 mugs of fresh coffee as we took our seats at the table. He smoothly slid the top document across the polished stone surface. It was the final legal paperwork, authorizing the transfer of the hard-won $500,000. The massive sum had been successfully extracted from the frozen accounts, completely cleared of any lingering fraud attachments by the federal investigators. Eleanor put on her reading glasses and picked up a simple black ink pen. She took a calm look at the paperwork, then glanced up at me, her eyes flashing with absolute clarity and purpose. She didn't hesitate for a single second. With a fluid stroke, she signed her name on the bottom line, permanently donating the entire fortune to a national foundation dedicated to protecting vulnerable elderly citizens from elder financial and physical abuse. She pushed the documents back to Marcus with a bright, beautiful smile. The violent greed that had almost destroyed our lives had been completely neutralized and transformed into a powerful financial shield to protect those who couldn't fight back. The legal execution was officially over, and the heavy ledgers of our lives had finally reached a state of perfect, absolute balance. The wooden floorboards of my back porch were completely quiet. I sat in my old rocking chair, watching the sun slowly sink below the lake horizon, painting the evening sky in deep shades of purple and gold. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of the lilacs my wife had planted with so much care years ago. Inside the house, Eleanor was leaning back comfortably in her favorite armchair, a soft blanket draped over her lap, reading a book in perfect peace. The absolute serenity surrounding us was no accident. It was a structure I had meticulously engineered and fiercely defended. Looking out over the manicured lawn, I thought about the deep, arrogant ignorance of the younger generation. The youth often blindly believe that power has to be loud to be real. They think power is all about expensive custom suits, screaming into high-end smartphones, and driving luxury cars they can't actually afford. They look at a quiet, elderly man sipping his morning coffee, and all they see is a soft target. They mistake a slower physical gait for a dull mind. They mistake a lifetime of patient tolerance for absolute weakness. Julian and Chloe made the ultimate fatal mistake. They genuinely believed they were the smartest people in the room simply because they were the loudest. They arrogantly assumed they could violently storm into our lives, take whatever they wanted, and ruthlessly crush us into the dust. But they tragically fail to understand the most fundamental law of nature. The most dangerous forces in this world never scream before they deliver a lethal strike. True power is entirely silent. It is the deep, quiet cornerstone that supports the weight of a massive structure. It is the meticulous, invisible preparation carried out completely in the shadows. I didn't need to yell or scream to destroy my greedy nephew. I didn't need to swing a violent physical punch to shatter his arrogant world. I simply stepped to the side and let the crushing weight of his own bottomless greed collapse right on top of his head. When you build a vain lifestyle entirely on lies and a delusional sense of entitlement, you are constantly waiting for the ground to split open and swallow you whole. The moment Julian coldly decided the mother who raised him was nothing but an obstacle to his wealth, rather than a human being worthy of respect, he sealed his own absolute downfall. He handed me the exact tools I needed to methodically dismantle his life. Now he will spend the next 15 long years inside a concrete cell, with nothing but his own destructive regrets to keep him company. He will have plenty of time to learn the lesson he refused to learn under my roof. Those who foolishly underestimate the quiet endurance of the elderly will inevitably be ruthlessly crushed by it. I took a slow, deep breath of the cool night air. The dangerous game was permanently over. The greedy predators had been completely rooted out of our garden. I gently pressed my foot against the old wooden floorboards, letting the rocking chair sway slowly back and forth, listening intently to the beautiful, magnificent sound of absolute silence. The greatest lesson hidden inside the wreckage of my nephew's shattered life is that true strength never needs to announce its presence. This frantic society often wrongly trains us to fear the loudest voices in the room, the aggressive demands of entitled people, and the blinding displays of fake wealth. But pure, real power lies in absolute patience and the quiet observation of human nature. When you mistake a person's silence for ignorance or their kindness for weakness, you are handing them the exact weapon they need to dismantle your life. Blind greed will always leave foolish people operating in the dark, building their heavy castles on shifting sands, while the truly wise simply sit back, waiting quietly for the inevitable tide to wash away their ridiculous arrogance. If you firmly believe that cold-blooded greed must always be answered by ruthless, calculated justice, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your own experiences dealing with toxic family members in the comments below.